I'm Mr. Rockwood, and we have with us today Oliver Miao, who is the CEO and a co-founder of Pixelberry Studios.
Yeah, first, it's great to be talking to you all virtually, even if it's through a pre-recorded stream. And I had for me, a kind of a unique and unusual way of getting into video games, and I hope this informs and helps a lot of you. You know, when I was growing up, PCs were still fairly new. I remember when I was in I think first grade, going into a computer lab, and they had just gotten their very first computers at the school, these TRS-80s, and being able to, load programs and play really simple games was already pretty fun. I didn't know it at the time, but my parents had, as a present, they had gotten a clone of a Nintendo system for me. And so all my friends had Nintendos, and I was always wishing, why can't I have a Nintendo like them? But I did have games like Super Mario Brothers, and I had a lot of fun playing them. And I think my mom, she didn't like how much I was playing video games, and she was actually quite happy when one weekend I just played that system so much that the plastic on the system melted and the machine broke. So as you can tell, growing up, I loved playing video games. I had a good time with them, but I never seriously considered it as a game profession. When I was in college, I'd play video games for fun as well. And I met a bunch of friends. We got really into games. We played a lot of Magic the Gathering as a card game back then, staying up late and playing together. And in hindsight, all this time we spent playing games was a great thing for us. I'll be honest, sometimes it was a distraction with our coursework and our classes. And that's something that, over time we needed to learn how to balance and to do better, especially when you transition from school into the workplace. That focus becomes even more important. And I did have friends in college. One of my closer friends, he actually had to drop out of Stanford because he was playing video games too much. And even though we tried to intervene and help him with that, it was just hard for him to stop playing and do his work or go to class. So, there's a clear balance there. And I'd say even as an industry, it's something that, game professionals think about all the time. So I was playing these games with friends in college, having a good time. And that was when Java first came out. And so whenever there's a new technology, oftentimes games are some of the first things that go onto those platforms. So I wrote a game for fun. My friends saw what I was doing, and they started creating a browser-based game as well. And we each had our own individual games. When we graduated, I actually went to join a startup. It was a non-gaming startup. I was doing developer support for this internet startup. It was kind of an exciting time, but what my friends and I had heard from other people who had graduated before us was that when you leave college, you start drifting away from your friends. And we thought, we really enjoy each other's company. We have a lot of fun together. And so we thought, what if we kept making games for fun together? And maybe one day we could turn it into a business, but doing it more just kind of for that social and friend aspect first. And so they graduated a year after me, and they went on to other jobs too. We'd work during the daytimes at our normal companies, and then in the evenings and on the weekends, we'd get together and create these Java-based games together. And at first, we were creating really simple arcade games, and then later multiplayer games. And we put them up on a website for fun. And it was great seeing kind of the reactions that people who found our games would have to the games. And I think that's the real power of a creator. When I talk to people who are in the games industry, I think universally what people love the most is that you're creating something and then you can see the reaction of kind of your players, and whether they enjoy it or they don't like it, they always have a response to it, and you kind of learn from that response.
And actually, I just would like to interject there. That's I think something that some of my students were really interested in hearing about was when this starts turning into a job, how can you keep the fun in it? And it sounds like you started with the fun, and hopefully then maybe that was able to be something you carried forward as you founded a company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been fortunate in terms of uh, because I helped to start a company and then been working on those games and been at a more executive level. um, I'm able to work on the type of games that are fun for me. At the same time, as you hear me talk more, you'll see that what I desire and what I enjoy in gaming doesn't always match what is best for the company or best for the studio. And I think that's something that it takes a lot of people newer to the game industry a while to kind of learn. And same with us. Um, those games we were creating for fun, those were games we loved playing ourselves, right? And other people like playing them. And we had later a venture capitalist actually get in touch with us and say, hey, these games are really interesting. um, I'd like to start a business with you and raise money. And we had all been out of college for anywhere from just like 2 to 3 years, so we didn't have a lot of business experience at the time. We talked about it, and we actually naively said no to him. And the reason was it was obvious that he wanted us to create games, but that he would handle the business part and tell us what type of games to create. And we wanted to have a lot more of that control, not only with our games, but also with the business aspect. And so we said no to him, but that kind of prompted us to think about what we were doing more seriously. And we decided to leave our jobs and start a company together. So it was four of us, three of my college friends and I. We started this company. We were all working out of the living room of my apartment, which was next to a train track, and just coding during the daytime and coding at nighttime, and having fun together. Um, we started this business in 2000, and during 2000 is when there was an internet crash. And so um, we were hoping to rely on advertising revenues, and those advertising revenues kind of dropped off. And we kept going at it for about a year and a half, not taking any salary, just using the savings we had and living pretty cheaply. um, and people loved our games. Like, we get high schoolers emailing in all the time asking us to change our IP addresses because their school labs had banned the games. um, and we'd
I'm just
even
going to say,
have
kids, that is your fault in my classroom. You are doing that to companies right now, all the time.
yeah.
Still a problem.
Not surprising. um, and we had a good time, but we weren't making money from what we were doing, because we hadn't really thought about the business model as much. We were just creating games that we enjoyed. And after a year and a half, we were actually running out of money, and we realized we had to shut the company down. However, we were super blessed. On the very last day, we were planning to shut our servers down that day and then start looking for jobs. We actually got a phone call from one of our friends, and he told us that his company had just signed a contract to make cell phone games, and but they didn't know how to make games, so they asked if we could do the development for them. And we jumped at that opportunity. It was a good chance for us to basically get paid to learn a new technology and keep making games. But what we did do is we kind of looked at that year and a half where we had failed and said, okay, we have a second chance. What did we do wrong, and how can we change things? And at the time, all four of us were actually coding. So we were all coding. I spent maybe 25% of my time on business, trying to reach out to companies or to advertisers. One of my other friends, he spent maybe 50% of time on coding and 50% of time on art. And then we all kind of did design together. And we realized that we needed to spend a lot more time on business. So I stopped coding and went to 100% on business, including cold calling people, and going to conferences and just talking to strangers. And I'll be honest, it was super uncomfortable for me. I'm an introvert by nature. And so for me to go to a conference and just talk to someone and with the purpose of asking them for business was very unnatural. And I had to step outside my comfort zone basically to help us save and grow the company. And if you talk to enough people, connections start to form, right? One time I went to a conference, a developers conference, and I would go to the sessions early. And maybe like 10, 15 minutes early, I'd sit down next to other people who were usually busy, like on their phones or doing something, waiting. And I just start talking to them, asking why they were there. And at one of these sessions, the person on my right was from Sony, and the person on my left was from Sega. And over time, we actually ended up getting contracts with both companies. And we started doing development work for other companies as well. And so, cell phone games were a lot smaller back then. So we created actually probably almost 50 games over the course of several years, both for other companies as well as for ourselves. And we took the money from doing work for other companies and put that into creating our own games. And eventually, we started building up partnerships with the different cell phone carriers like Verizon and AT&T, and we started publishing our games directly with those cell phone carriers. So this was before iPhones and Android devices. So the way to get games out to the public was through these carriers. And eventually, we created a game called Surviving High School. That was our company's first story-driven game. It was the first high school game out there on any type of platform, and it did way better than we expected. And based on the success of that game, we sold that first startup, Center Score, to Vivendi Games, who at the time owned Blizzard. And then 2 years later, Vivendi and Activision merged. They decided they didn't want to be in mobile games at the time. They didn't think it was a big enough business. And so they sold us to EA. So I think we may be the only studio that Activision has ever sold to EA. And it's because we were so small that they're willing to do something like that.
Wow, that's actually an interesting little honor to have, I guess.
Yeah. And I know some of the questions you've had, or for the students have been about like, how do we think about games and how do we design those games? So let me talk about that game, Surviving High School, and tell you about how we created it. And it'll kind of inform you how we started looking at things from an audience perspective. So prior to that, we had started creating games just that had been successful in other genres. The cell phone platform was so new, we thought, okay, if we create some casino games, if we create some sports games, other games that were popular in other genres, it would work well. But over time, the marketplace started getting saturated. Everyone had already created their kind of copycat games from other platforms. And what usually happens next is bigger companies start getting licenses. So they started licensing more well-known games, or else they started licensing TV show games like Jeopardy, which did well. And then eventually they started licensing video games like Pac-Man, and then bigger and bigger brands and movie brands, and creating bigger and bigger games. And because we were a small company, we realized we couldn't compete with them on licenses and brands. And so we started thinking about what are areas of the mobile games industry that people just haven't looked at all. And we looked beyond just other game media, but other forms of media. And we realized that high school was a theme that was really popular with like movies and TV shows and books, but there had been no high school games.
The YA genre just of gaming, I guess, was kind of absent at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's much more popular now, but people really weren't addressing that audience. And that's when we decided, hey, high school would be a great theme for us to work on. Initially, we were planning to do a role-playing game, so an RPG game, and you were going to level up, and you're going to fight other kids in high school, and kind of determine who, if you're the king of the school over time. But as my friends were starting to design that game, they realized that what made a high school game super interesting wasn't like fighting or action. It was all those story moments, right? That first day of class and the nervousness of meeting people, making a friend, choosing what activities you like, having crushes and how you deal with those crushes, going to prom, going to sporting events. All those things were the interesting parts of the game. And so they came back to me and they were like, we thought about it, and rather than doing an RPG, we think a story game would make a lot more sense. And they also told me, when it comes to technology, because cell phone devices couldn't do that much, they thought a story game was going to be great, because if you're making interactive choices, you're not really pushing, the speed of the device. You aren't dealing too much with intense graphics or with big memory concerns. And so that's how we pivoted the game from an RPG game to a game that better fit kind of that genre. At the time, we also became one of the first games to have recurring content. We released the game with a focus on kind of your high school adventure. And, it covered pretty much your first year. But after we released it, we realized how successful it was. And we built in some downloading technology so that you could start having new episodes or new chapters of your experience. And by doing that, it allowed people to keep coming back to the game. And at the time, you could either do one-time downloads or subscriptions, and we offered both choices. And because we had that recurring content, people would stay subscribed and come back more and more frequently. And I believe we were one of the first subscription-based games on any platform back then in the early 2000s.
So yeah, one thing that my students often ask about, at some point, they'd love to hear about how you think about monetization in the modern era. And clearly you've been here since the beginning of the iPhone era, making games for mobile platforms. Is that as the advent of both premium/freemium games and, as you say, subscriptions began to become a thing?
Yeah, I mean, the business model of games, it's really interesting how freemium has really changed things, especially on the mobile side. When we joined EA, they bought us because Surviving High School had done so well, and they actually wanted us to bring it to the iOS platform. And so we actually completely redesigned the game for that. And while we were doing that, we were obviously playing a lot of other games out there. And two games we really liked. One of them was Doodle Jump. And the interesting thing about Doodle Jump, we realized, was this was very simple kind of vertical platformer. But every month, they would spike in the download charts. And they would spike whenever they released a new update. And so it was showing us that when a new update came out, we were guessing that people were playing the game more often. They were telling their friends about it, and new people would come in and buy the game. And then there was another game called Pocket Gods, which would also have free updates. And it did the same thing. Whenever they had new content with like a new island, it would spike on the charts again. And so we went to the business executives and we told them, hey, we want to give away free content in our game because we see this phenomena happening and we think it's perfect with a story-based game. And they were like, no, we don't do that. We only do paid content. We don't want to give away free content. No. Come back to us for another green light. And by the way, in the industry, green light is when you have a concept and you want to pitch it to your executives and they give you the green light to move forward with that game. And so we went back, and this was the time when Apple just announced that they were going to allow for in-app purchases. And so we told them, okay, Apple just announced in-app purchases. We want to give away free content, but we'll only give it away for a week. And if people miss that week, then they have to buy the old content. And we told them it's kind of like the TV and DVD model, which was prevalent back then prior to Netflix and everything else. And we said, we'll give away free content, but it becomes locked later and people have to pay for it. And they were like, no, we don't want to give away free content. We don't think in-app purchases are going to make that much money. No.
Oh, EA and your track record of decision making. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so we went back, rethought about things. We came back to them a third time. We said, okay, we understand you don't want us to give away free content, but we think it's really important. What if we release the episode a week early to people, but they have to pay money for it? So they pay 99 cents if they want the content ahead of time. So for the Uber users, for normal users, they can still get it free every week. And then if they miss it, then they're paying for the back catalog. And they finally said yes, maybe out of frustration of us not changing our minds that we wanted to give free content. But unfortunately, they still didn't believe in the concept. And we know that because a month before we launched the game, right after we finished the game, they made me lay off all our designers, our developers, and our artists. And so we only had writers and QA left on our team just to support the game at launch. And when we launched the game, it hit number 10 in top grossing, totally exceeded their expectations, and was EA's first in-app purchase kind of success on mobile devices. And so as I tell you that story, you can see that business models kind of evolve over time. And sometimes when people tell you no, it's a good thing because it forces you to keep thinking about the problem rather than stop at the easy solution. And I think because we had to keep refining what we were planning to do, it actually made our business model stronger.
That reminds me of the story about how in Blizzard's World of Warcraft, they initially had a penalty for playing too much, a 50% XP reduction. But then when they rebranded it as a 50% XP bonus that you could run out of,
right,
it suddenly succeeded with the rested XP model. So yeah, like you say, just rethinking it, looking at it from a different angle, and you could eventually get the execs to maybe greenlight it.
Yep. Exactly. Like you just have to keep tweaking things, and even that example you're giving, it's the same concept, but even to players, how you approach it is very different, right? So a lot of times it's what's going to be most exciting and most compelling for your players, and remembering to always think kind of from the player perspective in your design. And during this time, right, we were creating these high school games. To better understand our audience, we would go watch high school movies as a team. We would go see like the Twilight movies. And so when we go on opening day, so it would be us and a whole bunch of teen girls in the theater at the same time. But it was important for us as a team to understand what our audience wanted. And that goes to making sure that the game you're designing, it's better to design the game not for yourself, but really for what you think players want. And so I'd really encourage you as students to first think about the audience that you want to target your game towards. And that audience could be people just like yourself. If it is, great, right? But then think more about, with that audience, what's really exciting for them and what would be interesting and new and different from them that they haven't seen out in the marketplace as well, right? So that type of game design is a different approach than picking something that you love and then iterating on that, which also works. But from my team's perspective, we're always looking at the audience first, thinking about what the audience wants and building our design based on that rather than saying, here's something we wanted, right? And that our first game, Surviving High School, with changing it from an RPG to a story game, it's because that design fit better for what we ultimately thought the audience would like. We were at EA, we had launched this game. Unfortunately, we didn't grow the team too much yet then. We reused the engine, launched another game called Cause of Death, which was more of a kind of murder mystery thriller type thing, but using the same type of engine. And then we came up with an idea to do another high school game that we had called High School Story. And it was going to be half narrative and half simulation game. Now, our team didn't have any simulation experience, so the execs were worried about that. But they thought the concept was fresh and interesting, and so they said yes. And what was really interesting is I ended up having 3 different bosses in the course of 3 months. That's how much turnover there was at the time. And every time I had a new boss, I tell them about this concept, they get excited about it, and they actually would give us even more headcount for our team. So our team kind of started growing more and more quickly. But eventually, I think we added people to the team too quickly. So our costs got higher. And also EA's kind of strategic direction shift. Their mobile games team decided to focus on branded titles rather than original titles. And, I think they also had concerns about the design as they started seeing more. And so they ended up having another round of layoffs. I put myself in that round of layoffs to try and save the job of another writer. They kept some writers in QA to support the existing game because of some obligations with the existing game, and that game was still making money. But everyone working on High School Story was laid off. And then a few months later, they decided they didn't want to support even the team that had been supporting Surviving High School, and so they laid the rest of the team off in a last round of layoffs. But during that round, they came to me and they told me, hey, Surviving High School is still making money. We just don't want to support the game ourselves anymore. Would you consider hiring your team back maybe and supporting that game, and we can do a deal with you? And I told them, that sounds great, but we were working on High School Story, and I'd really love to continue working on that game. Can we have the rights to that game? And when I had first left, I had asked for the rights for it, and they had said no. This time around, because we were doing a deal that would help them out on one part, they're willing, because in exchange for that, they're willing to give us the rights to High School Story with a royalty share. And so we started Pixelberry as a company. We started working on the game we had originally designed at EA. We redesigned the game and kind of rewrote the engine from scratch. And half our team was doing Surviving High School content, half our team was doing High School Story. And it was a great way for kind of half the team to support the other half of the team. And so we didn't have to raise any money. And we were very fortunate in that regards.
So you took that like experience, but also like the actual like literal code base and material you'd already built and used it to sort of keep pushing yourself forward.
Yeah, so we had the rights to the code base and everything. We decided actually to write a new code base, in part so that if we wanted to do future games using that code base, we wouldn't have to pay EA any royalties. And from a legal perspective, we may not even have had to do a license with EA, but we didn't. I think your reputation is really important. We didn't want to make my old bosses or executives at EA mad if we started, we released this game that was very similar to something we had first started designing at EA. And so that's why it was important for us to have the rights to that game. We actually changed the design a lot in kind of that new process of reworking on the code base. And it ended up being a very different game. But I think it's always served me well from a business perspective to try and do the right thing. And remembering that, even though the world may seem really big, you end up working with the same people again and again through interesting, strange connections, right? Like, one of those 3 bosses I told you I had in 3 months, later he started a company and he came to me for advice on how do you start a company and how do you raise money and do different things, right? So you want to treat people well, I think, and it helps you in the long run. With High School Story, the EA executives, clearly they didn't believe in it. They laid our team off. We launched that game, and it also hit number 8 in top grossing. So it broke the top 10 as well and did really well. And that was a really fun success for us. And the interesting thing about Pixelberry is before we started working on High School Story, I had actually thought about doing an educational game startup with my co-founders. And we had all been kind of recent new dads. And so I think it made us think a lot more about maybe leveraging our game experience to do something that had a more direct positive impact on the world rather than just entertaining people, which I also think is an important thing. But we thought the educational aspect would be great. But the more we researched educational games, the more we realized doing a startup is already hard enough. An educational games startup is even harder, right? You have this tension between education and teaching people but also trying to make the game really fun, right? And if you're creating an educational game for like preschoolers or kindergartners, I think is a bit easier because their parents are much more involved in the games they play. But once you're even creating a game for elementary school students, at that point, they already know what makes the game fun. And um, I'm not saying you can't have fun educational games, but it is a lot harder to design.
It's something that my students have actually had to deal with a little bit, because part of what we're doing at Quince Orchard High School is I'm encouraging them to try and build games that teach a concept or a lesson from one of their other classes without turning it into a, I don't know, Trivial Pursuit or flashcard database for a lesson without any fun attached to it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting problem to try and tackle, in part because it's so hard, right? Like you have to have mastery of both the educational concepts well enough so that you can think about how do you make this more fun and challenging at the same time, right? And fun is really interesting because it's not always like just something that makes us happy. Fun can also be associated a lot with challenges, right? And that's where a lot of games thrive, when you make it more challenging and hard enough so that when you overcome that challenge, you feel really good about that and solving that. And then repeatedly being able to do that and gaining and increasing your expertise at something can feel really good too.
And I think that your games actually trend to the style of game that teaches lessons inherently. Social emotional learning is something that is really important, and more and more research says that kids younger and younger and older even need to be able to play in order to learn how to interact with humans. My favorite author, Terry Pratchett, once said that interaction with other people, the social Brownian motion of life, is what turns someone into a fully paid up member of the human race. Without that, you're just there.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I mean, interestingly enough, I got into games because of my friends, right? And it was, I did have friends in high school, but it wasn't until college where I think I really connected with the smaller group of friends and really got to know them. And they ended up being the friends I continue to work with now. So I feel very fortunate in that regards. With High School Story, working on it with friends was fun and meaningful. But we always thought in the back of our head, like, well, we had thought about doing educational games, right? And we started Pixelberry instead, knowing that a game startup is really difficult and it's a very up and down industry. But we thought, okay, our goal will be commercially successful first. And if we're commercially successful, then we can start to layer in elements of education into our games. And so like a month after release, we actually got a message from one of our players, and it was through our in-game help system. And she told us in the in-game chat that she was actually planning to kill herself. And that was something we never expected to hear from within a game. And we were shocked and we didn't know what to do. Our COO, Kara, and we actually went into a conference room and we called the suicide prevention hotline to get advice from them. And we told them, hey, this player told us they're planning to kill themselves. How do we help them? And they told us that we should tell them to get professional help, and that's all we should do. And we're like, what if we talk to them some more? Or is there, things we could do to help more? And they're like, no, you should just tell them to get professional help. But we were thinking, because they reached out to us, if all we did was tell them that, you should go talk to an adult or go talk to a counselor, like they've had those opportunities already. And we were worried that, they would just think we're blowing them off and maybe they would go and try and kill themselves. And so because we were a startup, we were able to do something that I think larger companies aren't always able to do. We had a discussion with our management team, and we agreed that, we would tell them to go get professional help, but at the same time, we would tell the player that we were just there to listen, right? And it wasn't that we were going to try and tell them anything, because that seemed very risky too, but just that people cared and we were there to listen to them. If they wanted to talk about their problems, we were there. And that was the most nerve-wracking week for me and Kara, right? Every time we got a message from that player, we're like, oh, what's going on? And what was worse is when we didn't get a message, then we were wondering like, oh, are they still okay? And we made sure that we were both on there, both a male and a female. We didn't ask the name of the player um, or their age, and we just wanted to try and keep that information more private, but making sure there are two people on of different genders, just so that we could kind of keep each other accountable and make sure that everything was okay. And we just told the player we're there to listen. They started telling us more about their own story. And at the end of the week, they actually told us that they were getting help from an adult. And they said that it was because of our game that they were still there. And that was a very meaningful moment for us. And it showed us how powerful games can actually be, right? That, we created this high school game. We had characters and a storyline that this player could identify with enough that they were willing to reach out to us, probably because we weren't in their face, we're kind of anonymous, but also, we had characters that they could identify with, right? And it showed us that a really good storyline, really powerful characters can connect with people emotionally. And we decided to use that moment to start using our game to do more good. And so we picked the topic of bullying because while we were going through this, we started talking about our own high school experiences with people in the studio. And it actually reminded me of a time when I was in middle school where I had been bullied. And I had actually even forgotten about it because I just didn't want to remember, where, whenever my Spanish teacher was late for class after lunch, a much bigger 8th grader, and I was in 7th grade, would actually pick me up and hold me kind of partially over a trash can, or put me in like a chokehold and stuff. And I was never sure if he was joking around or how serious he was, right? And I never told my parents about this until I was in my 30s, after working on this with High School Story. Because when I was in junior high, I was always scared, like if I told my parents, this guy was just going to pick on me even more, or maybe he'd snap and it'd be worse, right? In hindsight, I realized that talking to a teacher, talking to my parents, talking to an administrator would have been the best thing to do. And so we partnered with a nonprofit that focused on cyberbullying. And we wrote a cyberbullying storyline into High School Story. And later we partnered with other nonprofits on eating disorders and other social, emotional topics. And it made a difference in our players' lives. The nonprofit, whenever someone was being bullied, or if they had other issues, like suicidal thoughts, or they were cutting themselves, self-harm, or reports of abuse, we would connect them directly to the nonprofit. Those trained counselors would talk with those players and get them help. And the nonprofit told us that it made a meaningful difference in the lives of a lot of our players.
And so you not only did what you want, did what you could yourselves, but then you connected more and more professionals into the system and turned the game into a channel, like sort of like a resource for these people, when it was still really a game. And it wasn't gamifying education. It was just making a good game and then using the community there to offer support.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing too, and I think you see the same thing with TV and movie shows and other forms of media, it's problems that people face and these crises, they actually make for very compelling stories, right? So it actually makes the game stronger, but it also gives you a moment where you might be able to connect people to get more help, right? So our intention was still to create a great game, right? But then to leverage that game to help people when we could. With our latest game, with Choices, we aren't quite as direct. We don't work with nonprofits as closely as we did in the past, But instead, what we've tried to do is use our game to steadily just connect people with each other more, or with their ideas and concepts. I remember when, the day when it was announced that Trump was elected president, it was a very shocking day for most of America, right? Regardless of what side of the political spectrum you were on, I don't think people were expecting that to happen. And I remember some people in our studio were really sad, right? There are other people in our studio who were happy. But the thing was, at the time, it felt like the country was very far apart, and there was a lot of divisiveness. I wrote a blog post about this to our players, and just talking about our philosophy with choices. What we were trying to do, especially with the story game, is if you can have diverse characters in your game, and you're friends with these characters, in the course of the game, it's a natural way to actually understand other people's viewpoints in a less intrusive way than maybe in real life, right? And so that's what we try and do with choices. We try to have a variety of viewpoints, whether it's sexual orientation, diversity, racial diversity, or other areas, just helping people to see how other people live or think. And it's been really rewarding seeing kind of the different comments we get from different players, right? We have people from the Middle East who will be like, I always felt alone until I played choices, and I felt like this character was me, or I could relate to this character, and I know there's other people out there, right? Or people saying, knowing that there are other people like me, makes life so much easier for me. And then, we have a lot of players who just tell us much more simpler things, but still meaningful to them, where it's like, I'm a mom, and during shelter in place, I go crazy, and at night, I relieve my stress by playing your game. Thanks for that. And that's where, I think gaming, regardless of whether you're trying to leverage it for good, it's a powerful medium, and it's a great way to entertain people and help people step out of themselves, right? And if all you're doing is creating a game that gives people a lot of joy and entertainment, that in itself can help people through a tough time. And we've had people tell us that too, right? And I've heard from other developers too. Like, sometimes a game is just a way for people to step outside all the miserableness that's going in their life at that point in time, and help them to get through something tough, right? And it's something that I think I've learned over time. I used to treat gaming, I think, a little, even when I was in the games industry and making games, a little more superficially. And now I appreciate how much power it actually has.
That's one of the things that I think our little industry, which has grown massively and is now a massive industry, has been teaching people in the past decade or two that finally this isn't just about a sort of like solitary, divorced from reality interaction with a computer. There's this vast array of ways that the game can let you interact with the world or with a story, and so having the opportunity to look at this new and emerging medium, still emerging because technology is changing all the time, is really interesting. And the fact that it has changed even in just the course of your career, from mobile games not even being a thing to it being something you can orient a company around, is really fascinating. Just like trajectory of reality.
Yeah, I mean, how you even get into the game industry is very different now, right? There's game design programs in high school, right? Which is incredible, and it's awesome. And there's game programs in college, right? And that's a great way to get into the games industry. But just like before, when I was creating games, there's always opportunities to just create your own games and kind of learn from that as well, right? And talking to different people, there's some people who they very much know they want to be in the games industry and they know how to get in there, or what they want to do. They want to be a 3D programmer on a AAA title, right? And if you know exactly what you want to do, then there are ways to kind of tackle that. Other people, and I think a lot of the people I end up talking to, they love games, they think about it as something they want to do, but they're not sure if it's for them, and if it is for them, whether, how to get into it. My advice to all of you, first is, the games industry is not an easy industry to be in part because there are a lot of layoffs. It's such a hits-driven industry that most companies, they create a big hit, and then over time it goes down in revenues, and they have to create another hit to kind of keep things going before the next one goes down, right? And so that's why you see all these layoffs in studios happening. You hear about programmers and developers working really long hours, and not having good work-life balance sometimes. And so those are all things that I think, regardless of any industry you're in, work-life balance is something that you need to kind of set those boundaries for yourself and realize that even if you're working on a dream project, you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of your players, right? But for those of you who are unsure whether you want to be in the games industry or not, I think it really boils down to, is creating something, is that joy you get from creating something meaningful enough for you to go along with some of the sacrifices in the game industry, right? In our industry, most positions you get paid less than in other industries. So if you're a programmer, our company's in the Silicon Valley. If you work at Google or Facebook, you'll make more than if you work at a game company, right? For the same type of skills. And in part, it's because there's so many people who want to be in games because they love playing games and they think they want to make games, that they're willing to take kind of a hit on their salary, right? If you're an artist, there are other industries, especially in marketing art, as an example, where you can make more money than if you were doing game art. But there's that real joy, if you love games, of creating art for a game that you're making, that your friends and family can see as well, right? So I think these are all things to think about before you want to dedicate a life to being in games. But for those who are in the games industry, if you go to something like GDC, the Game Developers Conference, you'll just see people who love their job so much, right? Whether they're doing an indie game or they're part of a large 200-person team, right? Like, you can tell they're just excited to be there, and they like working with like-minded people. One of the things that I love the most about the game industry is you are working with people who are passionate about what they do, right? Some of the newer employees we hire at Pixelberry, they wanted to join and they applied because they had played our earlier games. Either they had played High School Story or they had played Choices and they were a fan and they wanted to write for Choices, right? And when you have fans who are working within the company itself, it's super fun.
There's a lot of my students who have asked, both here on the list of questions they submitted and in previous classes of mine, they've asked things like, when you are looking for a job, or when you're building up skills, what are the kinds of things that like a game company is going to want people to have done if they're coming from, probably from college, not from high school directly, but if they're coming from school and not necessarily from another position, what should a person who's building themselves up for a career try to throw themselves into in order to be a good candidate? Because a lot of these kids, both currently and past, my students have a lot of passion for the thing they're creating, but they're just not sure how to go about turning that into a career.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. It's not always easy getting into the game industry, or even just getting your first job in the first place, right? I remember when I was interviewing for my first jobs, it was very nervous, right? Did I have the experience people were looking for? Would they actually like me? I think when you look at game companies, there's two types of hiring, or people doing hiring. There's the more traditional route where you actually have recruiters who actually don't even do the jobs themselves, and they're going through resumes. They're looking for catchphrases or type of experiences that they can funnel to a hiring manager. And so for those recruiters, making sure that that's where things like going to the right program, if it's a game design program, or having a good GPA, doing well in your CS courses or design courses or writing courses will help a lot more. And then you have the hiring managers who care more about kind of the individual. I think one thing people don't realize is when you submit for a job, there's always an opportunity to go above and beyond, right? And one thing I always recommend candidates do is to write a really good cover letter, and not just one cover letter, but to make targeted cover letters for the companies you really care about and you really want a position with. Because if you make it more personal, and the more specific you can be, and the more personal you can make it, the more impactful it will be, right? Even now, sometimes when I see cover letters or I read emails from people where it's obvious that they love choices, we'll give that candidate an extra look. And we still need them to have kind of the skills we're looking for, but that gives them a much deeper look than from someone else. Also, if there's a dream company you want to work for, let's say you want to work for Valve, right? Get really creative in how you can approach them. You may have heard some of these creative stories before where people will bake a cake or do different things. Usually when it's more relevant, it's better, right? We had someone from the Midwest who sent us a customized video reel of choices, and it was kind of like her own trailer of choices out of stuff she had found and put her own time into creating. And it was the first time I had ever seen someone create a marketing reel for choices and send it to us. And we told her, hey, we're not hiring for someone remote right now. We're only hiring within the Bay Area, but we'll keep you in mind. And later, for another position we had, I remembered her. I told, the head of our art team to reach out to her because she had created this really cool thing. And we were open to a remote position then. And so we ended up hiring her and having her join, right? When we hire writers, we're looking for writers who it's obvious that they understand our demographic, right? And that they're creating things, characters that are relevant. So when people send us writing samples, when it's clearly targeting a young adult audience, that matches so much better than someone creating a generic writing sample. We have students who've sent us their own versions of an interactive chapter, right? And because we don't see too many of those, we'll play through those, right? It's very different than when we have someone just send us a generic writing sample.
Oh dear! By saying that, you may trigger an avalanche of inappropriately under hiring age responses, because half of my class is interactive stories using Twine.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar, but
Yep,
Twine
absolutely.
and things like that, choice script for choice of games. So that's basically what I teach them to do.
Right. If you have something interesting you want to show us, feel free, right? I mean, I do think being in high school on the other side of the coast does make things tougher, right? If you were willing and your parents were okay with a summer internship, right, where you're on the West Coast, after coronavirus and shelter in place and everything is open, that's something we're sometimes open to. We have hired high school interns in the past, and we had one high schooler who started with us as a sophomore. He continued working part-time for us in college, and he now works for us full-time as a producer. And when he was in college, he was creating music for us. And when we hired him, he still did some music, but now he's much more focused on just helping us get all sorts of content out for choices.
That's the kind of like transitional story, like where you may enter the industry with one job, but then explore other opportunities as they arise. That we've heard from one of my former students is working as a product manager, which is a job she'd never heard of until she was at the company, having started as QA while in college doing an internship program. So it's kind of like, I think that sounds like, is that something you would say is relatively normal, is getting in through one route and then looking around at other jobs after you're there?
Yeah, I would say it is depending on the type of company, it is normal, and sometimes it's not. So at a larger company, for instance, when I was at EA, I knew a lot less people who would switch from their QA team to other groups. And I think with a large company, some of the departments sometimes get more segmented. At Pixelberry, we just had a woman who transitioned from QA to becoming a producer, and we have other people who've moved into other positions, or we've had like our writer. Well, Kara, she started as a writer and she's now our COO. So she's one of the executives at the company. The executive producer of Choices also started as a writer, and just over time through their experiences, learn more. And now, he essentially runs Choices and what we do at Choices. So definitely getting in at, one position, and then over time demonstrating passion, showing expertise, and that you're still willing to learn can definitely help with the transition. But I would caution people to, with kind of a QA job, making sure if you are looking at a QA job as a transitional job, probably to try and look for a smaller company where there's more opportunity to actually interact with other departments, and not to assume that that's actually always going to be a job progression you can make happen.
Thank you. That's really important to hear, because this is a CTE course where students, if you don't remember what that means, career and technology education, you're supposed to be here to learn about how the job industry actually works wherever you're focused. And so thank you for addressing that, because I know a lot of what my students have mentioned to me in the past is that they think that's the kind of thing that is very common, but if it's not going to apply to all sectors of the industry, that's important to know.
Right. Yeah. And I think another thing to do, like, as you heard from my story, right, I was in a totally different industry, but I kept working on games for fun. And then I transitioned to it in a very unusual way in terms of, creating our own startup, which is a very difficult thing to do. But there are other people I know who they've had other jobs. They keep thinking about wanting to get in gaming. And so they keep working on a project, nights and weekends. And they are able to leverage that project as kind of a demo or proof that they're passionate about games, and they get into gaming from that perspective. Some of the programmers we hire, they've had no prior gaming experience. They're good programmers, but because they've shown us their side projects, we're like, yeah, let's hire this person because obviously they have a passion for it. And ultimately, I think what a lot of hiring managers are looking for are people who have the skills, but also who are really passionate and good, would be really good fits for the team.
It sounds like that's definitely something that researching the company, like you say, is really important. And I think, especially in our industry, where if we're talking about a company that has already produced games, if you write a cover letter and you don't demonstrate that you're aware of the games that they've made, that would be a really big missed opportunity to make an impression, since it's not like applying for a job at a Starbucks where your cover letter may be about your passion for coffee in general, but it's probably not about your passion for this particular location.
Yeah, absolutely. The more specific you can get, it always helps to give you a leg up. At the same time, it's not you have to match with the company. They have to have available openings. And so, I would find a few companies you really care about and that you'd put more time and effort into, but also try and get your resume out to other companies. And it can take time, and sometimes there's an element of luck, right? And having that right opportunity. And so you just have to try enough times, right?
It's just like, well, the games we play, right? If you're used to trying something and it doesn't work the first time, you try again until you've ground that skill to the next tier, or until you got lucky on the drops. And like my former student who's working at a game company in the Baltimore area, she applied, she did get an excellent opportunity, but she also had applied to 60 different internships, not all within the games industry, during her final years in college. And so it sounds like even if you have a great goal, even if you've got a specific company in mind that you'd love to work for, don't just assume you'll start there. You gotta look around and play the field, look at the options.
Exactly.
You make a game that is difficult, or at least appears difficult, without being off-putting?
Um, when you're some of those first games we were creating, especially the ones I was doing for fun, my friends and I, we all made our games way too hard because the more we were working on the level design, we were like, oh, this is easy. And the more you play it, the easier it becomes to you. But when we put it in front of our friends, we realized that it was much tougher for them than we expected. And so that's part of getting people to test it and play it, and watching them and learning from that actually helps a lot. Um, we see the same thing with choices in our earlier games, where even now with choices, sometimes we think most players will choose a certain story path and they end up making a very different choice, or we have different characters that we think will be popular and it ends up being other characters are more popular. And that's the beauty of a choice driven type of game. You can see that feedback, and this is another thing that's changed a lot in the games industry. um, you know 10 years ago, even, people weren't looking at data that much, and now data is so important because you can more immediately see what your players are doing and how they're thinking about things, and you can see if they're getting into trouble, right? So when you're creating the game, being able to put those hooks in place so that you can see the choices your players are making and see how they're going through a game gives you the information for kind of how you tune your game, right?
That's a, yeah, big deal right now, especially with the advent of Telltale's The Walking Dead, which exploded sort of like the console and PC choice-based adventure game renaissance.
Yep.
And then Life is Strange, which is one of my tattoos, and then The Walking Dead is the other. You've got these games that track player choice, and it almost becomes, at least hopefully it does not become a bitter rivalry, but it generates fan action, because they want to forward their favorite characters and they want to forward the ending that they chose, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you actually, at choices at Pixelberry, while you're looking at the data, does that guide ever the plots of individual games? Have you ever changed an ending based on fan reactions?
I think it may subtly change the ending more so than it does longer term. I think there's an element of you know and I think different game studios are different, right? But at Pixelberry, our writers, um, they have an outline for the entire story before they start writing that first chapter. And so they already know what the end is going to be like. But in the course of writing that, there are characters who may become more prominent or not. And so they may change their outlines based off some of that. And um, this is where it's also interesting in terms of, when we first launched Choices, I think we were actually a lot more flexible than we are now. As your team sizes get larger, it becomes more and more rigid because you're trying to get things out on time. You have so many different teams working on things, right? And so you have to start planning a lot more. And that's where those roles like a product manager or producers come in, where they help schedule and make sure different teams are hitting different milestones and you can collaborate and work together, right? Um, it does make me more nostalgic and for when you first start a game. So like when Choices was first starting and it was a smaller team and you could just make changes on the fly much more rapidly, right? You know, um, for some of our first stories, like we rewrote those initial chapters a lot of times before we even first started getting players to test them, just because of the reactions we were getting from people within the studio and realizing like, hey, these beats need to be stronger. We need to hit these harder. And that's a really fun part of designing games. It may be stressful at times, thinking about how do I tune this, or am I doing the right thing? But also step back when you get frustrated and remember like, hey, you're doing something you love, right? And I think that really helps.
Wow, I think that's really like uh, a great interview we've had. But I just want to pause here and say it's been over an hour, and I don't want to eat up your entire afternoon. So thank you so much. Is Is there any last words you would like to give us before I let us wrap up?
I'd say the last piece of advice I'd have, it helps with both the games industry or trying to get a job in the games industry, but also just with life in general, hopefully, is to really look at the long-term picture of things and to look at the forest and not to get caught up on the trees. Like, don't get caught up on an individual class or an individual game, and think more about how things are going to be longer term, right? This can apply to things like getting married and stuff too, right? When you're worried about, like, is this the right person or not? Don't just think about how you feel in the moment, but also, like, if you want to have children, like, hey, is this person going to be a good father? Is this person going to be a good mother, right? All those type of things are kind of a longer term look on life. And if you take that higher level, longer term look, it actually helps to make your smaller decisions easier. And we do the same exact thing with our game, right? We know that, with surviving high school, we knew that we wanted to be a high school game. And so if we knew it was going to be a high school game, everything else kind of derived from that, including completely changing the game mechanic, right? And then when we're working on those storylines, it's very clear to us which storylines were going to be most meaningful, because they were the ones that tied back into the biggest high school themes, right? And when we're working on storylines and choices, we do the same thing. You kind of take that big overhead view and all the little things tie up to that. And so when you're stressed about an individual decision, just tie it back up to that. And so whether it's in games or life, try and remember to always go up another level.
Thank you so much. That is a really great piece of advice, I think. And also, and then I want to apologize for letting you talk for more than an hour and then asking you more questions. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's totally fine. I've had a good time talking with you. It's been great. You guys are fortunate. You have a teacher who loves what he's doing, and at the same time, he's willing to reach out to people, right? It's kind of like when I told you that story about Sega and Sony. Like, I was lucky in that session that those were the two people who were sitting there, but I had talked to probably 100 people prior to that, right? And all of a sudden, the two right people were there. With your teacher, right, he's reaching out to different people. He didn't necessarily expect to get the CEO of Pixelberry to answer a reply or anyone to reply, but you don't know until you ask. And that's part of looking for a job too, right? You got to ask, you got to try. And I'd encourage you to just keep on trying.